It's been years since that night, yet I still remember it vividly, as if it were yesterday. Before I tell you what happened, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Lucas Mendez, and back then I was a newly graduated doctor, full of ambition and confidence. My first job was in a small, rural hospital far from the bustling city where I grew up. Fresh out of residency, I was eager to prove myself. I believed I could handle anything, illness, trauma, even death, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night. The hospital was a forgotten place. Its dimly lit corridors stretched into silence, the peeling walls echoing faint footsteps and muffled whispers. Staff members were few, and resources were scarcer. Most nights, I would sit at my desk in the on-call room, reviewing patient files or reading to pass the time. That particular night was no different. A gentle drizzle tapped on the windows, and the wind whistled faintly through the cracks. I remember glancing at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The halls were still, and all the patients were resting. Or so I thought. The calm was shattered when I heard the distant sound of frantic voices. Seconds later, a nurse burst into the room, her face pale. "Doctor, you need to come now." I grabbed my stethoscope and hurried down the corridor toward the emergency room. The tension in the air was suffocating. I pushed through the double doors and stopped. On the gurney before me lay a man, his clothes torn, body covered in bruises and dirt. "What happened?" I asked. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. "He was found outside near the forest," one replied. I nodded and approached the patient, my instincts kicking in. But something was off. The man's skin was deathly pale, his chest still. I placed my stethoscope on his chest. Nothing. The monitors attached to him were flatlining. No heartbeat, no breathing. "He's gone," I muttered. Then his eyes snapped open. For a moment, I froze. Those eyes, empty, unseeing, stared right through me. My pulse quickened as the man's lips began to move. Soft murmurs escaped, words so faint and fragmented that I couldn't understand them. "His vitals are still flat," a nurse whispered, trembling. I leaned closer to the man. "Sir, can you hear me?" His lips continued to move, forming sounds that felt more like distant echoes than speech. My body tensed as I noticed his chest wasn't rising, despite his murmurs. My mind raced, searching for explanations. Catalepsy, some rare condition, but deep down, something colder gripped me. "Who brought him in?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "No one knows," another nurse replied. "He was just there. Someone found him by the edge of the woods." The murmuring grew slightly louder. My heart pounded as I thought I caught a word. "Neo, something in Portuguese, maybe?" I turned to the nurse closest to me. "Do we have his name?" The room went still for a second. "Doctor," her voice faltered. "It's Olevo." I looked at her, confused. "And?" The color drained from her face. "Senior. Olevo died 3 weeks ago." I blinked, thinking I had misheard her. "What do you mean, died?" "This man is lying right in front of us." She shook her head vigorously. "No. He died, doctor. We never found the body, but—" Her words were cut off as the lights flickered violently overhead. A sharp metallic noise rang out as one of the 4 stands crashed to the floor. The nurses gasped and backed away. I clenched my fists, determined to stay calm. It's probably a power surge, but then I smelled it. The unmistakable odor of damp, freshly dug earth. It seeped into the room, thick and pungent, as though the ground had been disturbed beneath our feet. My skin prickled. The murmurs stopped. I turned back to the man. His eyes were closed again. The monitors remained flatlined, and yet I felt him watching me. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. I tried to steady my breathing, but the smell of damp earth was everywhere, clinging to my clothes, my skin. The nurses were whispering nervously behind me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the man on the gurney. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered. "Are you sure it's the same Olevo?" One of the older nurses stepped forward, her voice trembling. "We all knew him, Doctor. Senior. Olevo was a patient here, and he died. He had no family, no funeral. The body," she paused, her face pale, "disappeared before we could send it to the morgue." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Disappeared? My logical mind rejected it. Bodies don't just vanish. Before I could respond, the lights above us flickered again, this time longer. The soft hum of the machines buzzed erratically, and then, with a final flicker, the room was plunged into near darkness. "Check the power," I ordered. My voice echoed off the walls as I reached for my penlight. Its beam cut through the gloom, shaking slightly in my trembling hand. That's when I noticed it. The patient's hand had shifted. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But no, his fingers, smeared with dirt, were curled differently, as though clutching something unseen. I stepped back, nearly stumbling over a stool. "Doctor!" one of the nurses screamed, pointing to the corner of the room. I turned the light instinctively. The corner was empty, but the wall, it was different. Dark streaks spread out like veins across the pale paint, as though the surface itself was rotting. My light trembled as I followed the streaks upward. That's when I saw the faint scratches, words carved into the plaster with something sharp. Macabre komoi, the hair on the back of my neck rose. I backed away slowly. The nurses clung to each other, frozen with terror. We need to leave," one stammered. And for the first time in my career, I couldn't disagree. The emergency room was silent. Too silent. The faint hum of machines had stopped, replaced by an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. I turned to the nurses. "Get out," I said, my voice low but firm. "I'll handle this." They didn't need convincing. One by one, they filed out of the room, glancing nervously over their shoulders. I was alone. Alone with a man who wasn't breathing, wasn't alive, and yet, somehow, was there. I shone my penlight across his face again, almost expecting him to open his eyes. He didn't. He lay still, too still, like a grotesque mannequin. The words on the wall seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision. "Neo Macabre komoi. What do you want?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. The smell of earth intensified, almost suffocating. My penlight flickered and died. I cursed softly, smacking it against my palm, but it was no use. The darkness swallowed the room whole. That's when I heard it. A faint shuffling sound, soft, deliberate, coming from somewhere near the gurney. My throat went dry as I reached blindly for the door. The handle was cold, slick, as though covered in dew. I twisted it, but the door wouldn't budge. Shuffle. The sound was closer now. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would burst. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, even though I didn't want the answer. Then, something touched my hand. It was faint, like the brushing of a fingertip, but I felt it. I know I felt it. I yanked my hand back, stumbling against the gurney, and my eyes widened. The sheet covering the patient was no longer smooth. It was crumpled, twisted, as though something underneath had moved. Panicking, I turned and slammed my fist against the door. "Help!" I shouted. And then the lights came back. The room was empty. The sheet on the gurney was neatly folded, taking the unmistakable shape of a human body. On the wall, the message remained, carved deeper now. Neo Macabre como eu. I staggered back, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. I stumbled out of the emergency room, my breath ragged and chest tight. The corridor was eerily quiet, the lights still flickering, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. I leaned against the cold concrete, trying to regain control of myself. "This isn't real," I repeated like a mantra, my rational mind clinging to science and logic. "Dr. Mendez?" The voice startled me. I turned sharply to see Rosa, one of the younger nurses, standing a few steps away. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened in there?" she whispered. The others said, "They said you saw him." I didn't answer. What could I say? That a dead man had been on the gurney? That something had touched me in the dark? Rosa looked down at her shoes, her voice trembling. "Senior. Olevo. He used to say strange things before he died." I frowned. What kind of things? That something was coming for him. He said the ground was restless, like it was waiting to take him back. The others thought he was delirious. A chill ran through me. I remembered the smell of damp earth, the words scratched into the wall. "Where was he found?" I asked. Rosa hesitated. "Near the old graveyard in the woods." The graveyard. A place I had heard about from some of the older staff, though I never paid it much attention. The town had a long history, one that seemed tied to those woods and the hospital's land. I rubbed my temples, trying to think clearly. What happened to his body? "No one knows," she admitted. "It was just gone." The next morning, the morgue was empty. Her voice trembled on that last word, and I felt my stomach twist. A cold realization crept over me. Senior. Olevo hadn't come here to be saved. He had come to warn us. The smell of earth tickled my nose again. I turned instinctively toward the end of the hall. The lights were out, and the darkness seemed alive, pulsing and shifting like a living thing. "Doctor, what's happening?" Rosa whispered. Before I could answer, the silence broke with a faint, rasping sound coming from the emergency room. I froze in place. Rosa grabbed my arm, her grip trembling. "Doctor, we need to leave. Now." I didn't move. My eyes were glued to the emergency room door. It was ajar, the darkness behind it yawning like the mouth of some unspeakable abyss. The faint, rasping sound, like the dragging of fabric, was unmistakable. "We're not going back in there," I muttered, pulling Rosa with me. "Come on." We hurried down the hall, our footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. I could feel something behind us, a presence I couldn't name, watching, following. The smell of earth grew thicker, nearly suffocating, as though the walls themselves were rotting. We rounded the corner to the nurses' station, where a small group of staff huddled, whispering anxiously. Their eyes darted toward me as we approached. "What's happening, doctor?" one of the older nurses asked, her voice tight with panic. "Get everyone out," I said firmly. "No. I don't care how, just leave." "But the patients." "I'll take responsibility," I cut her off. "Something's not right." We need to go. No one argued. The air was too heavy, the fear too real. Rosa moved to gather the others while I turned toward the exit. But as I took a step forward, I felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. A faint whisper brushed against my ear. "Lucas." I stopped, ice crawling up my spine. I turned around slowly, but the hallway was empty. Only the lights continued to flicker. "Doctor," Rosa called from down the corridor. "What's wrong?" I opened my mouth to answer, but then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, where the emergency room door stood ajar, a shadow moved. It was tall, elongated, and it slid across the wall like ink spreading through water. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination. And it was coming toward me. "Run!" I shouted. Rosa screamed, and we bolted for the exit. The smell of earth was choking now, and the whisper grew louder, filling the air around us. "Macabre como eu." We burst through the double doors into the night, gasping for breath. For a moment, everything was still. But as I looked back, I swore I saw the shadow standing there, just inside the hospital doors, watching me. The night air should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Outside the hospital, the silence was thick, unnatural, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Rosa stood beside me, trembling, clutching her arms as if to keep herself together. I tried to steady my breathing, but my mind was racing. "What was that?" she whispered. I shook my head, unable to answer. I didn't know. The rational part of me, the doctor who believed in science and logic, was silent now, eclipsed by a primal fear I couldn't shake. The hospital loomed behind us, its windows dark. I couldn't help but stare at the emergency room entrance. In the faint light, I swore I saw the shadow again, tall and distorted, as though it were watching us. "We need to call someone," Rosa said. "The police, the director, anyone." I wanted to agree, but deep down, I knew no one would believe us. How could they? A dead man who moved, shadows that crept across walls, and a smell of earth that spoke of things better left buried. "We need to leave," I said instead. "We can't stay here." Rosa hesitated. Her eyes filled with terror and doubt. "And the patients?" I swallowed hard. "We'll send help once we're out. It's not safe." She nodded reluctantly, and we began walking toward the old staff parking lot. The gravel crunched under our feet, an oddly deafening sound in the oppressive silence. I fumbled for my car keys, my hands trembling. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A voice. "Lucas." I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. Rosa looked at me, confused. "What?" The voice came again, closer now, carried on the wind. "Macabre como eu." Slowly, I turned toward the hospital. The shadow was still there, but it wasn't alone. The shape of a man, a figure I recognized instantly. Senior. Olevo stood in the entrance. His face was obscured, but his outline was unmistakable, and his arm, it was raised. He was pointing directly at me. "Get in the car," I shouted, yanking Rosa toward the vehicle. I fumbled with the lock, my hands trembling, the shadow of Senior. Olevo burned into my mind. The wind picked up, swirling dust and the suffocating smell of earth around us. It was as though the ground itself was alive, reaching for us. I yanked open the door, practically shoving Rosa inside. As I slid into the driver's seat and turned the ignition, the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the hospital entrance. I froze. No shadows, were spilling out of the doorway now, stretching across the parking lot like dark fingers. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires squealed against the gravel as we shot forward. Rosa screamed as the smell of earth filled the car, seeping into the vents, choking us. "Don't look back," I shouted, though I couldn't stop myself. In the rearview mirror, I saw the hospital growing smaller, but the shadows followed, sliding along the ground like a living tide. It felt like an eternity before we reached the edge of town. I didn't stop driving until the hospital was miles behind us, the road stretching into the empty night. Only then did I pull over, my hands still gripping the wheel tightly. Rosa sat beside me, silent, her face pale as a ghost. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. What was that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I stared at my trembling hands, the smell of earth still lingering in my nose, and I knew the truth. It wasn't over. I resigned the next morning, leaving the hospital and that town behind forever. I told myself it was over, that senior. Olevo's warning had been meant for someone else. But deep down, I knew better. Sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear his voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Neo Macabre como eu, and when I turn to the darkness, I feel it, the shadow that never left. It's always there, watching, waiting. I never thought I'd end up here, in an empty hospital, walking through its dark corridors every night. My name is Daniel, and for a while, I worked as a night security guard. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a temporary job, a way to keep things steady after losing my previous one. I thought I'd find peace in the silence, but I was wrong. This hospital had been closed for years. Some parts had been stripped clean, but others remained untouched. Dusty beds, old monitors, rusted wheelchairs. It served as a storage space now, but no one ever came here, at least not at night. It was just me, the sound of my footsteps, and the hum of the wind outside. On my first nights, I followed a routine: walk the halls, check the locks, and avoid thinking too much. It wasn't scary, not really, just lonely. That's what I told myself until that night. I was walking down the main corridor, my flashlight bouncing weakly off the walls, when I saw them. Footprints. Wet footprints. They were fresh, leading from the entrance into the darkness ahead. I frowned, kneeling to touch the floor. The footprints were damp, unmistakably human. But outside, it hadn't rained for days. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A leak somewhere, maybe. Still, I felt something shift in the air, like the silence had grown heavier. I finished my rounds quickly that night and left without looking back. But the footprints returned. The footprints began appearing almost every night. They always started near the entrance, leading deeper into the building, as if someone, or something, was walking through the corridors just ahead of me. I never found a source, never heard another sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. One night, while making my usual rounds, I turned a corner and froze. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, someone was standing there. My heart stopped. It was a woman. She wore a long white coat, a doctor's coat, though stained with something dark, and her hair was long and shockingly white, hanging loose over her shoulders. She was still as a statue, her face obscured by the shadows, but I could feel her eyes on me. I took a step forward. "Who's there?" My voice echoed, thin and shaky. She didn't move. I forced myself to take another step, then another. The closer I got, The colder the air seemed to become, and the smell of damp, stale earth filled my nostrils. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Just gone. One moment she was there, and the next, the hallway was empty. I stood there, frozen, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. She was real. And she was still there. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Who would believe me? A figure appearing and disappearing in an abandoned hospital. It sounded insane. But the following nights were worse. The footprints kept reappearing, and this time I wasn't just seeing things. I was hearing them. Soft, deliberate steps that seemed to follow me as I walked my rounds. Occasionally, I would hear faint echoes of laughter or crying. It was distant, distorted, as if coming from somewhere deep within the building. Finally, my curiosity, or desperation, got the better of me. On my day off, I decided to look into the hospital's history. I spent hours at the library, digging through old newspapers and records until I found something. Years ago, before the hospital shut down, there had been a scandal involving a doctor named Dr. Helena Almeida. She had been accused of performing horrific experiments on her patients, things too cruel to describe. When the accusations surfaced, she lost everything. The hospital suspended her, and a month later, her body was found in one of the corridors. She had taken her own life. The description of her, white hair, the blood-stained coat, sent a chill through me. It was her. The woman I'd seen. That night, when I returned to work, I felt her presence stronger than ever. The air was cold, the smell of damp earth overwhelming. And as I turned a corner, I saw her again, closer this time. The final night I spent in that hospital is one I will never forget. I started my shift as usual, but everything felt wrong. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. I walked the corridors quickly, trying to ignore the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. The sound started softly at first, faint whispers, then giggles. A childlike laugh echoed down the hallway, growing louder. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hands, but there was nothing there. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The laughter stopped abruptly. Then came the sobbing, a low, broken cry that made my blood run cold. It was everywhere, surrounding me. I turned toward a glass door leading to one of the old operating rooms. My breath caught in my throat. In the reflection of the glass, I saw her. There. Helena stood right behind me. Her face was pale and gaunt, her hollow eyes staring into mine. Blood stained the front of her coat, dark and fresh. Her mouth curled into a faint, unnatural smile. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. I turned back to the glass. She was gone. That was it. I ran. I didn't stop to check the rest of the building. I didn't care. I burst through the front doors and into the night, gasping for air, as if the walls themselves had been suffocating me. The next morning, I quit. I never set foot in that hospital again. But even now, when I see my reflection in a dark window, I wonder if she's still standing there, watching me. It's been years since I worked in that hospital, but I still remember every detail. My name is Daniel, and back then, I was a nursing technician doing night shifts. It wasn't my dream job, it was what I could find at the time. Quiet nights, a steady paycheck. That's what I thought I'd signed up for. The hospital was old and struggling to stay open. Rooms sat empty, hallways stretched forever, and silence clung to the place like a heavy fog. My shift began at 10 p.m. and ended at sunrise, and on most nights, I barely saw another soul. It should have been peaceful. It wasn't. I remember the night everything changed. It started like any other. I was reviewing a chart at the nurse's station when a supervisor approached me. "Daniel," she said, "I need you to check on a patient in the isolation wing." I frowned. Isolation? I thought that wing was closed. She just looked at me. "Room 14. Go now." The isolation wing was in the farthest part of the hospital, a place no one ever used anymore. I grabbed my clipboard and flashlight and headed down the long corridor. My footsteps echoed as I walked, the only sound in the emptiness. When I opened the door to room 14, I froze. A man lay on the bed. He was pale, deathly pale, his eyes open but vacant. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I swear, I could feel him watching me. I stepped closer, hesitating as the cold air in the room bit at my skin. Something wasn't right. Patients were supposed to be monitored, with machines and charts, but this man, there was nothing. No nameplate, no no monitor beeping softly in the background. "Sir," I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond. I moved to the foot of the bed and pulled out my clipboard, flipping to a blank sheet. "What's his name?" I muttered to myself, searching for any identification. Nothing. No record. The man's breathing was so shallow I could barely see his chest rise, but he was alive, wasn't he? I leaned closer, trying to catch a glimpse of his face in the dim light. His lips moved, so faintly I almost didn't notice. I froze. He was whispering something. "What did you say?" I leaned in, heart pounding. The words were incomprehensible, a low muttering that made no sense. But the way he said them over and over felt wrong, like a recording stuck on repeat. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from behind me. I jumped, spinning around, but the room was empty. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied. I turned back to the patient, but he was motionless again, staring at the ceiling. I left the room quickly, my steps loud and hurried in the quiet corridor. When I reached the nurse's station, I searched the system for any record of room 14's patient. There was nothing. No admission, no chart, no name. It was as if he didn't exist. I couldn't sleep the next day. The man's vacant stare, his whispered nonsense, it wouldn't leave my mind. I kept replaying the scene over and over, searching for some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. When I arrived for my next shift, I decided to ask around. Maybe someone knew something about room 14. I approached Marissa, a nurse who had worked at the hospital for over 2 decades. "Hey, Marissa, do you know anything about a patient in room 14? Isolation wing." Her face paled. Isolation wing. No one uses that place anymore. I was sent there last night, I insisted. There was a patient. A man, pale, vacant eyes. Marissa's hands trembled slightly as she put down the chart she was holding. "You shouldn't have gone there," she muttered. "What are you talking about?" I pressed, my frustration growing. After a long pause, she sighed. "Years ago, patients started disappearing from that wing. It got so bad they closed it off. Some of the old staff said it was cursed. They swore they heard whispers and saw figures wandering the halls at night. Most people don't even talk about it anymore." Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. Disappearing patients? Whispers? My mind reeled as I tried to process what I had just heard. I needed answers. That night, I decided to investigate room 14 again. The air was heavier as I approached, my flashlight flickering faintly. I pushed the door open, and the room felt even colder than before. And there he was, the man. This time, his lips weren't moving. Instead, there was something new. Words were scratched into the wall above the bed. "You are next." My heart nearly stopped. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The words on the wall, "You are next," were carved deep into the plaster, jagged and uneven, as if written in a fit of rage. I turned toward the bed. The patient hadn't moved. He still lay there, staring blankly at the ceiling, but something felt different, wrong. I wanted to leave, to turn around and never come back, but my feet wouldn't move. My body felt anchored to the spot, paralyzed by a fear I couldn't explain. Then I heard it. The whispers. They started softly, like the faint rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, surrounding me. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, accusing, mocking, relentless. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the room, but there was no one there. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, echoing and twisting through the air. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped. Silence rushed in like a wave, and for a moment I thought I was alone again. But when I turned back to the bed, the patient's head was tilted toward me. His eyes, blank and lifeless, were now locked on mine. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I bolted from the room. My footsteps pounded down the corridor as the whispers began again, louder this time, chasing me. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. "You're not crazy," Marissa whispered from behind me. "We've all heard them. You just listened for too long." That night was my breaking point. I sat at the nurse's station, shaking, Marissa's words echoing in my mind. "You just listened for too long." I wanted to leave. I had to. But my shift wasn't over, and some stubborn part of me clung to logic, to the idea that there had to be a reasonable explanation. I told myself I'd stay just until morning. But the hospital had other plans. It started with the lights. First, a faint flicker, then complete darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers returned, louder this time, layered and overlapping until they became a dissonant chorus. "You are next." The sound came from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the empty rooms. My hands trembled as I turned toward the corridor leading back to the isolation wing. There, in the darkness, I saw him. The patient. He stood at the end of the hallway, his silhouette faintly visible in the dim light of my flashlight. He was no longer still. He was moving toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice breaking, but he didn't stop. The whispers grew deafening as I turned and ran. My shoes slammed against the cold floor, my flashlight bouncing wildly. I could feel him behind me, closer with every step. I didn't dare look back. When I burst through the main doors and into the night air, the whispers stopped. The cold vanished, replaced by the crisp breeze of the early morning. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, the hospital looming behind me like a shadow. I quit the next day. I never went back. But even now, when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear it, faint whispers calling my name. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I see him, the man from room 14. I'll never forget those nights. Some patients never leave. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.